I don't think we've got anyone else here. Is Roger here? No, I think he's probably at the cottage. Well, in that case, we will go straight on to Allan Bartley, who is our speaker. Allan is an adjunct professor in the political science department at Carleton University. He is retired from the Federal Public Service, where he was an intelligence analyst, manager, and executive in several departments. He is also a former journalist. He's the author of Alexander McNeill, A Political Life, and Heroes in Waiting, the 160th Battalion in the Great War. Allan researched the history of the Ku Klux Klan in Canada for more than a decade and published the article, A Public Nuisance, the Ku Klux Klan in Ontario, 1923 to 27, in the Journal of Canadian Studies in 1995. Today, we are looking forward to hearing about his latest book, The Ku Klux Klan in Canada. Welcome, Allan. Oh, nearly called you Anna. That's terrible. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to your group. I'm going to call up a PowerPoint presentation, so I appreciate if you bear with me while I try and overcome the challenges of technology. And I may not have overcome them yet. Give me a second here, please. So this is a topic, as Rowena mentioned, that I've been looking at for quite some time, actually. 10 years is an abbreviation. I started looking at the Klan back in the 1990s for reasons which were more happenstance than anything, and which I'll come to in a few minutes. But the story of the Klan in Canada intrigued me because, like many people, I had no prior knowledge that the Klan had been active in this country. But as we see on the screen, the Klan had a very visible presence in Canada a century ago. The cross that you see burning in that image is in Regina in a park in 1928 on the Victoria Day weekend.
I don't think we're seeing your screen yet.
You're not seeing that? Okay.
No.
Let me see if I can fix that.
Technology is so much fun.
Indeed it is. I taught my first Zoom course this past winter, and if it hadn't been for the students instructing me, I would have been lost.
I think it's coming. There you go.
Okay. Yes, the students were very kind to me and helped me through a learning curve that was quite steep. So the image you see there on the screen is the iconic Klan symbol of the burning cross. And this particular cross was erected in a park in Regina on the May 24th weekend of 1928. And it, to me, symbolizes the presence of the Klan in Canada, which is not generally known or widely understood, I think, nor has it been for the last century. And one of the reasons that I finally decided to go forward with researching and writing the book over the last few years was my concern that we were losing track of some of the history that we have in this country that we may not appreciate, nor in fact acknowledge. So the Ku Klux Klan, as I'm sure many of you know, is an American-based organization that was stood up in the summer of 1865 in the wake of the end of the United States Civil War. It was created in the American South by former Confederate Army servicemen under the leadership of a Confederate general who was concerned about the nature of and the disintegration and the public order issues that were coming forward in the wake of the Civil War in the American South. And General Nathan Bedford Forrest conceived of the Klan as being a kind of militia that would help restore public order in the defeated states of the American South. And from the perspective of white residents in the American South at that time, the communities were in total lawless chaos. And they identified the source of the lawlessness as being newly freed slaves, who in fact were no less lawless than many of the white residents, and particularly returned Confederate servicemen who came back to a society that had been totally upended from what they had left. The Klan was originally envisaged as a means of keeping former slaves in order, reimposing some kind of, excuse me, form of civil peace. The Klan took as one of its signs a burning cross, which was to signify that local Klan chapters were gathering and would be rioting at night in order to preserve public peace, which really usually meant inflicting some kind of harm on the Black communities that were coming out of the very traumatic era of not only slavery, but the recent Civil War. The Klan, as it evolved, became so violent and so engaged in criminal activity that the United States government banned it in the late 1860s. General Forrest formally disbanded it a couple of years after its formal creation, and the Klan itself basically faded away into the background. It became a kind of an underground organization that existed only in remote areas far from sources of authority, and it became an organization more mythical than real in the latter part of the 19th century. It returned into the public eye in the late 1890s, early years of the 20th century, largely through the work of a writer named Thomas Dixon. Dixon was from the South. His father had been a member of the Klan during its vibrant years. So he had personal experience and exposure to the Klan. He wrote a novel called The Klansman, which told the story of a white Southern family that lived through the Civil War and lived through the chaos of the post-war era, and which portrayed the Klan as a force for good, defending white populations and defending white womanhood. The Klansman became a bestseller in the United States. Dixon turned it into a play, which toured widely in the early years of the 20th century in the American South, and did very, very well, and revived the whole myth of the Klan as an organization that had the interests of the white population at heart. The Klansman and the play caught the eye of David Ward Griffith, who was a producer in Hollywood. This was an era when motion pictures were just coming into their own as an entertainment medium. And Griffith, who was also from the South and who also had family members who had been part of the Klan, caught Griffith's eye as a potential movie. And he began working on what eventually became known as The Birth of a Nation, which was not only a novel film, but a film which had a number of features to it that were quite unusual for this early era of motion pictures. It was more than 2 hours long during an era when films were 20 minutes, half an hour. It had large-scale action scenes with battles, the burning of Atlanta being the featured lengthy scene in the film, and it happened to fit with the public mood, which was seeing a revival of interest in the Klan and concern about the arrival in the United States of large numbers of European immigrants, and many of them Roman Catholics. And there had been a longstanding concern in the US about the growing prominence and strength in communities of the Roman Catholic Church and the schools that they sponsored. So the creation of The Birth of a Nation as a film extravaganza and as a cultural event was quite prominent. The Birth of a Nation was launched in the spring of 1915, and it played to enormous audiences around the United States during this era. It was well received, obviously, in the United States, and it coincided with, in Georgia and in the city of Atlanta, the presence of an individual named William Simmons. Simmons was a former teacher. He was a former Methodist minister. He was an underwear salesman. He was an inveterate joiner of fraternal organizations. And he saw in The Birth of a Nation and the publicity around the launch of the film an opportunity to revive the Ku Klux Klan of 50 years before, which is what he did. The creation of the Ku Klux Klan in the 20th century coincided with the opening of The Birth of a Nation in Atlanta in the spring of 1915. The revival of the Klan at that time didn't really catch on. But as the film grew in popularity and as people became much more aware of the background of the Klan and were seized with the images and the iconography of the Klan and the message that the Klan had been peddling in the post-Civil War era, updated for the 20th century, combined with some new organizational techniques, the Klan as an organization really took off when you get into the era of the 1919, 1920, 1921. You have the creation of a sales organization based on Kliegels, who were recruiters for the Klan, selling memberships, selling the robes, renting the regalia, and the creation in Atlanta of the Imperial Palace for the Ku Klux Klan. You had the birth of an organization in parallel with the showing of a film that was essentially a recruiting film for the Ku Klux Klan during an era when movies really came into their own as an entertainment medium. And The Birth of a Nation came to Canada. What you see on the screen there is a picture of Lawrence Solomon, who was an entertainment entrepreneur in Toronto. He had an amusement park on Toronto Island, Hanlon's Point. He had a baseball team, and he owned and managed the Royal Alexandra Theatre in Toronto. He was a man of some contradictions, quite interesting. He didn't like movies, but he saw in The Birth of a Nation an opportunity to do a lot of business, which he did when The Birth of a Nation opened in September of 1915. Solomon was also Jewish, but he seems to have been oblivious or chose to ignore the messages that the Klan was promulgating about Jews and the anti-Semitic conspiracies that the Klan was peddling, along with some of their anti-Black, anti-Asian, anti-Catholic, anti-East European, anti-immigrant mythologies that they used as a sales device during this era. The Birth of a Nation opened in Canada to the same kind of response as it had in the United States. Very popular lineups around city blocks in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. The only place that the film didn't play well was in the Maritimes, particularly in Nova Scotia, where it was banned. It was banned there because it was seen to be detrimental to the war effort. And the view was that anything that upset civil society and race relations in Nova Scotia with the Port of Halifax being a key element of the Canadian war effort. This was bad, therefore the film was banned in that province, but it did very well, for example, in New Brunswick and elsewhere in Eastern Canada and in Western Canada. And it allowed Canadians in general to sort of share in a cultural phenomenon that had swept across the United States and was increasingly prominent in Canada. And it dealt in the same kinds of ideas that had some currency in Canada during this era. So there were a number of reasons why the Klan was attractive to Canadians. Ironically, there was a high degree of tolerance for ideas and organizations and spokesmen for these organizations that we probably wouldn't tolerate now. But at the time, there was a lot of acceptance of some of these things. The image you see on the screen there is the Orange Lodge parade in Toronto in 1925. The Orange Lodge was a very strong organization in this country, very pro-British, pro-Protestant, anti-Catholic, anti-French, and it enjoyed a high degree of public support in many parts of the country. So there was a lot of tolerance for these kinds of ideas. At the same time, there was a significant amount of bigotry and racial intolerance, most of it directed to Francophones, Asian communities, Aboriginal communities. And so there was an undercurrent in Canadian society 100 years ago that was ready to be exploited if the opportunity was there to do so. And the other reason that the Klan became an attractive option and Canada became an attractive destination for Klan recruiters is that there was a lot of money to be made by selling memberships in the Klan. In the United States, the original Klan leaders made millions and millions of dollars personally, and the organization itself was extremely wealthy. It owned factories that turned out the robes and the regalia that we associate with the Klan. It owned real estate. It owned an insurance company. It owned movie theaters and a movie production company, Cavalier Productions, that produced films that were then shown in the Klan-owned theaters. So the Klan was big business and it made a lot of money. And Canada was essentially an untapped market coming out of the First World War and into the early 1920s. So what we see getting into 1920, 21, 22, 23 are Klan recruiters coming across the border and selling memberships in the Klan to Canadians. There were some problems with that business model. One is that Klan memberships at the time required the members to swear allegiance to the United States. Well, that didn't go over all that well, even if there was a lot of attraction to some of the ideas that the Klan was propagating. So you had people like Eugene Farnsworth in the Maritimes coming out of Boston and doing extremely well in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia as a recruiter. In BC, which I'll come to in a few minutes, you had Major Luther Powell, who was a star recruiter in the Pacific Northwest states, came across the border and sold memberships. And you had traveling recruiters going through the prairie provinces and into Ontario. But this wasn't really sustainable from an organizational point of view. That changed in January of 1925 when you had two individuals arrive in Toronto. Charles Lewis Fowler and James Henry Hawkins set up a national Ku Klux Klan headquarters in Toronto. They were in business with a local individual named Richard Cowan. Cowan had been worked for a brokerage in New York during the early 1920s. He had seen how popular the Klan was and how profitable the Klan was in New York and in the States during the early 20s. And he brought the idea back to Canada and teamed up with Fowler and Hawkins to create a Ku Klux Klan of Canada. And the Klan, in its original foray into Canada, was extremely popular. There was a sales initiative, and I use the word deliberately, during the spring and summer of 1925. And you had clan organizations set up in most towns and cities across southern Ontario, including Kingston and Belleville. Hamilton was a major clan center. London, Smiths Falls became an extremely strong clan center. There were as many as 500 clan members in Smiths Falls. There were organizations in Brockville, Richmond, up and down the Ottawa Valley. So, including in Ottawa itself very briefly during 1926, 1927. And these were not small local groups. These were groups that could attract rallies of as large as 5, 10, 15, 20, 25,000 people would come to a clan field day, as they were called, excuse me, usually associated with athletic events, with guest speakers, and at night with the burning of a cross or crosses, and the selling of memberships and the initiation of new members into the clan. And so the clan became extremely popular and extremely rich during 1925, 1926, 1927, during that era. Became so rich and so popular that James Henry Hawkins struck out on his own and created a parallel organization called the Ku Klux Klan of the British Empire. So you had Fowler on the one hand selling memberships in the Ku Klux Klan of Canada. You had James Henry Hawkins selling memberships in the Ku Klux Klan of the British Empire. And so with both organizations really vigorously marketing themselves across the province, it's no wonder that you had these large numbers of people participating in the organization. And you had these iconic hundreds of cross burnings across southern Ontario, eastern Ontario, western Ontario during these years. And there was a lot of money to be made. I like this image, which was taken in Kingston, a place called Bracken's Grove, northwest of Kingston in June 1927. It's photographed by a man named John Boyd, who was a very enthusiastic amateur photographer working out of Toronto, which is another story. But I like this image because it tells a number of stories, I think. One is that these were very popular gatherings when the clan had a rally. So you see the cars, you see the crowd of people, and this is only a small portion of the crowd. You see the clan robes and regalia. You see the cross being prepared for the burning after dark for the initiation of new members. And when you look at the uniforms of the robes, you can tell that these are members of the Ku Klux Klan of Canada, which was the Charles Lewis Fowler organization, because on the left shoulder, they've got the maple leaf with a circle around it. If these were Hawkins's members of the Ku Klux Klan of the British Empire, the maple leaf would have been replaced by a Union Jack. So it gives you a sense of the flavor of the times and the kinds of crowds that a Klan rally could attract. Members did not necessarily own their robes outright. They could buy them, of course, from the Kleagle. If they wanted to own them, they could rent them. They could also buy or rent the regalia that went with the Klan. And so there was a lot of money moving through a lot of hands as part of the Klan movement and organization. Because of the popularity of the Klan and because of the nature of their activities and because of the nature of the people that were joining the Klan, the Attorney General, excuse me, of the day, William Nicol, who was an MPP out of Kingston, so he knew the kind of attraction the Klan was having, in 1925 asked the Ontario Provincial Police to begin an investigation of the Klan. And if there is a hero in the Klan story in Ontario, it's Inspector John Miller of the Criminal Investigation Branch of the OPP. The Klan file landed on his desk, and it became his principal preoccupation in 1926, largely because a Roman Catholic church was bombed in June of that year. and the Klan was rumored to be the cause of the bombing. And as it turned out, based on Miller's investigation, the Klan indeed was responsible. 3 members of the Klan in Barrie were charged, convicted, and sent to Kingston Penitentiary for 5 years for having bombed St. Mary's Catholic Church. Miller had spent a significant amount of time on the Klan, and one of the things he did was recruit human sources in the Klan who were reporting back to him. And the reason that he was able to make a very early arrest in the Klan was because of his human sources inside the Klan organization. In recruiting these people, Miller had spent about $30 of his own money to pay his sources, and he then tried to claim the money back from the OPP, and he got a lot of pushback from his senior officers. There was a lot of memo writing back and forth, and in the mid-1990s, when I was in the Provincial Archives in Toronto researching another topic, I had a few minutes to spare, and I started going through index files. And what I found was an index file reference to the Ku Klux Klan, which intrigued me because I had no knowledge of the Klan being active in Ontario or anywhere in Canada for that matter. So I called up the file from down in the vaults, and what I got was the correspondence between Miller and his senior officers, with Miller explaining the nature of his investigation of the Klan, trying to justify why he'd spent $30 of his own money to recruit sources, excuse me, and trying to claim his money back. As far as I could determine, he never did get his money back, but what he left behind was a really fascinating story about an investigation into cross-burnings and beatings and fraud perpetrated by Klan leaders and members across the province during the year from 1925, 26, 27, 28, and beyond. So you never know what you're going to find in archives, and in this case, I think we owe Inspector Miller a debt of gratitude for his record keeping. As you get into the later years of the 1920s, you see some changes in the Klan organization in Ontario and across the country. You get rallies where members would take off their masks. This was very unusual. It didn't happen in the United States. It started to happen in Canada for a couple of reasons. One, it was a sheer marketing ploy. Excuse me. The thinking being that if Klan members exposed their faces, their friends and neighbors would see them as Klan members, and they in turn would be interested in joining an organization like the Klan and ponying up the money that Kliegels would pocket. So to join the Klan during this era, it depended on what kind of local costs a Kliegel had to incur. But a Klan membership ran anywhere between $12 and $16 to join, and then there was an ongoing monthly fee. If you wanted to rent the robes or buy the robes, then there was more money involved. In Winnipeg, one of the newspapers talked about $13 suckers. So that was the going price in Winnipeg to join the Klan. And the view was that if you had $13 to throw away on a Klan membership, you were indeed a sucker, at least in Winnipeg. So you get these big rallies. This one was in St. Thomas in September of 1927, and it attracted members from across Ontario and from Michigan. A lot of American members would come across the border and join with their brethren in Southern Ontario. The Klan in Ontario reached its high point or its low point, depending on your perspective, in 1930. In January of that year, a Klan, I wouldn't call them a mob because they were too organized and disciplined to be considered a mob, but about 75 or 80 Klan members from Hamilton, which was a very strong Klan center, drove out of Hamilton up to Oakville in mid-January of that year. They erected a cross in the middle of Oakville. They set it alight after dark. And then they went to the home of a young man named Ira Johnson, took him into custody, went to the home of a young woman named Isabel Jones, took her into custody, and took both of them to their respective parents' houses and warned all of them that if the two continued to be seen together or to be together at all, then the Klan would return to Oakville and deal with them. The Klan was laboring under the idea that Ira Johnson was Black, Isabel Jones was white, and this went against all of the Klan's teachings on race mixing and all of the evils supposedly that went with it. As it turned out, Johnson was Aboriginal. He was a wounded war veteran and was not happy about how the Klan treated him, as had every right to be. Anyway, on the way back to Hamilton, the Oakville police, which had 4 members, caught up to the Klan parade and recognizing the disparity in numbers, ended up giving the Klan a police escort back to the Hamilton city limits. The chief of police in Oakville said that the Klan members had been peaceful, that there was no cause for concern, and I think he was bowing rather to numbers rather than the potential for violence. Anyway, when the Attorney General found out about the police escort, he ordered an independent investigation, with the upshot being that 3 Klan members were charged under the criminal code. They went to trial in January of 1930. William Phillips was a chiropractor in Hamilton. Harold Orme was his assistant, and Reverend Ernest Taylor was a Methodist missionary to the Italian community in Hamilton. He was a justice of the peace. He was fluent in Italian, hence his particular mission to the Italian community, which was largely Catholic. Taylor was an interpreter in cases in the courts in Hamilton, so he was well known to the police and to lawyers in the legal system, generally in the city. They were charged with wearing a mask after dark for an unlawful purpose, which was an obscure part of the criminal code. Only Phillips was convicted. Orme and Taylor said they didn't wear their masks, and the evidence seemed to support that, so they were let go, but Phillips was convicted. He was charged, convicted, and sentenced $50. The Ontario Attorney General appealed, and on appeal, Phillips was had his conviction quashed and his reinstated at 3 months in jail. He went off to the Holton County Jail in Milton, had a lot of popular support, launched himself on a hunger strike, and received a lot of support from the Orange Lodge and other members of the public. Didn't make any difference. He ended up spending 3 months in jail. And that was essentially the high point of the Klan and its presence in Ontario during the 1930s, continued to exist in pockets here and there across the province. But as the Depression took hold, the attraction of the Klan and the money to join local Klan organizations became increasingly less attractive as an organization. That didn't mean the Klan didn't have a presence elsewhere in the country. It was very active on the lower mainland of British Columbia. You can see the mansion in Shaughnessy Heights in Vancouver that they had as the local Klan headquarters. You can see Major Luther Powell giving what he called the Klan salute in the gardens at the mansion headquarters. Powell was extremely effective as a salesperson. The salute he's giving looks a lot like a fascist salute, which in fact it was based on. The fascist movement in Italy in particular was very popular in some parts of Canada at the time and in the United States. And as it turned out, Powell and some of his followers eventually ended up in the fascist movement. So there was some congruity of thought and actions. There was some significant public leaders for the Klan in the West Coast. You see here Reverend Clem Davies, who was a Presbyterian minister in Victoria in the mid-1920s. He was a very vocal Klan leader. He had what they called a radio ministry at the time. So he preached through a local radio station, had a lot of followers, became very active in the Klan on Vancouver Island, moved on to Vancouver, eventually moved on to Los Angeles and became very active in fascist circles in Los Angeles during the late 1930s and 1940s. The other image you see there is 3 Klan leaders at the Shaughnessy Heights Mansion. Dr. Keith Allan, who'd been a member of the Klan in Portland, Oregon, had to leave under suspicious financial circumstances. R.G. Wallace came out of Oklahoma. He tried to sell Klan memberships in Winnipeg, but didn't do all that well in Winnipeg, and moved on to the West Coast and joined Powell there. And then again, Luther Powell helping hold up the Union Jack. The irony, of course, is that these are all Americans. The Union Jack was a prop for recruiting purposes, and they were very good at using the Klan mythology and welding it to some local animosities towards Asian minorities, usually. But speaking to a growing sense of support for fascist ideas in the Lower Mainland. Powell was eventually deported. The other gentleman wandered off because the popularity of the American leadership waned quite quickly after Powell was deported. Where the Klan really had a large political presence was in Saskatchewan. A recruiter named Pat Emmons arrived there in the fall of 1927, sold tens of thousands of memberships across the province. There was an estimated 40 to 50,000 members before Emmons left with the Klan treasury in 1928. And this was a significant organization in a province that had only about 900,000 permanent residents. Jimmy Gardner was the Liberal premier in Saskatchewan during this era. He identified the Klan very early on as a potential threat to his government. When Emmons left the country with the Klan treasury, there came into play a new, largely Canadian-based leadership, which took the Klan organization and revived it from the fall they had after Emmons' departure. And there were 2 leaders who became very prominent. One was James Henry Hawkins, who'd gone back to the States after leaving Toronto, and he returned to Saskatchewan to help prop up the Klan and sell memberships. And John Joseph Maloney arrived in Saskatchewan from Ontario. He was a former candidate for the priesthood in Hamilton and Montreal, had a falling out with the Catholic Church, and had become a virulently anti-Catholic speaker in Ontario in the mid-1920s before he hauled up in Saskatchewan. The Klan exercised a significant political influence in the province in the late 1920s. They threw their support behind the Conservative Party of John Anderson, and the Conservatives won the 1929 provincial election largely on the basis of the support they got from the Klan organization across the province. And that's not my judgment in particular. It's a generally acknowledged assessment from some very significant historical researchers with much more authority to speak than I do. When the Conservatives came to power in Saskatchewan in late 1929, J.J. Maloney expected that he would get a position in the new government, and he waited and he waited and he waited, but for all kinds of good reasons, the Conservatives decided they didn't want anything to do with J.J. Maloney. Maloney, just as a sidelight, had married into a family in Biggar, Saskatchewan, who were cousins of Premier Howard Ferguson. And as you probably know, Ferguson was the MPP in Kemptville during the 1920s and 1930s. So we had a very distant and I have to say remote relationship to Kemptville, but I just thought I'd mention it because I found it quite interesting at the time. Maloney, after he failed to get a job with the Saskatchewan government, moved on to Alberta, and he and a couple of organizers really applied themselves in the province, largely with the support of the Orange Lodge, which was quite popular in Alberta during this period. And they created local clan claverns in all of the major cities and towns across the province. There was, again, a membership that reached well into the tens of thousands across Saskatchewan during the 1930s. And they were very active in organizing and mobilizing opposition to the Catholic Church, to separate schools, very anti-union, very opposed to immigration into Alberta, particularly from Eastern Europe, particularly if the immigrants happened to be Catholic. So it was not a benign presence in the province. These were very active and hard-fought political battles. In the bottom image, you see a crowd that were involved in a special train that the Klan organized from Edmonton to Wainwright in eastern Alberta in March of 1932 to protest the creation of a separate school district there. So this was an organization that could generate large crowds. Edmonton became a particular stronghold for the Klan in the early 1930s. Again, you see a crowd that the Klan brought together to protest the presence and the influence of the Catholic Church in Edmonton, again in the spring of 1932. So this is not a fringe organization. This is a mainstream political presence. And in the fall of 1932, in the municipal elections, Don Knott was elected as mayor, and he did so, again, largely on the strength of the support of the Ku Klux Klan, and publicly acknowledged that support and became not a vocal supporter of the Klan, but certainly a silent supporter of the Klan and its activities in the city for the next couple of years. You see the rally in the picture. There's a man in the front center. Some people have said that looks like Don Knott, and indeed it does, but there's no confirmation of that. But certainly it's consistent with Knott's support for the Klan during this era. As the Depression took hold during the 1930s, there was less money, less interest, and less support for the Klan, not only in Alberta, but elsewhere across the country. As happened a lot with Klan leaders, J.J. Maloney took off with Klan money. He was charged with fraud. He was charged with false pretenses and a number of other criminal charges, not just in Alberta, but in cities across the country. And the Klan withered away, as it were. Maloney himself died in poverty back home in Hamilton in 1944. His mother had to bury him. They had no money. And the Klan as an organization faded out across the province of Ontario, the province of Alberta, and across the country, and remained largely an ugly memory for about 30, 40 years until it came back in the 1970s. Came back largely on the strength of this man, David Duke, who was a white supremacist leader in the state of Louisiana. He revived the Ku Klux Klan in the United States, in Louisiana, in the mid-1970s, and became a fixture in the right-wing white supremacist community in the United States, and is still alive and is very active in that milieu still. You see this collage of photographs from his days as a Klan leader with the Klan uniform through to an elder statesman of the American right wing. David Duke was amongst the first people to congratulate Donald Trump on his election as president in 2016, which tells you a lot about both David Duke and Donald Trump, I would argue. One of the reasons that we can consider David Duke to be the godfather of the revived Canadian Klan in the 1970s, 1980s, is that he had a number of young Canadian followers who traveled to Louisiana, knew Duke, knew his organization, and took a lot of their ideas from him. And in 1979, 1980, two of them, James Alexander McWhirter and Wolfgang Droege, revived the idea of a Canadian clan and revived the Ku Klux Klan of Canada as an organization. McWhirter, who was in his early 20s, became the Imperial Wizard. And for a couple of years, they had a very strong presence in certain parts of the country. Toronto, the prairies, and particularly the Lower Mainland. Klan organizers and Klan members significantly involved in a number of violent activities, and they left behind a residue of hate in this country that's still with us. They provided an organization that supported and promoted bigotry, and they supported and were involved in significant kinds and levels of criminality. McWhirter and Droege both went to jail. McWhirter and Droege together were part of a conspiracy to take over the island of Dominica in the Caribbean and use it as a white supremacist headquarters. That came to nothing, and they both went to jail for their involvement in that conspiracy. McWhirter was involved in a false documents operation, creating forged checks, passports, birth certificates, you name it. He went to jail for that. Droege became involved in selling drugs, both in the United States and in Canada, went to jail in the United States, eventually came back to Canada, and that's not a surprise given the nature of the kind of people who the Klan attracted. McWhirter came out of jail in the late 80s, eventually received a pardon, and has sort of still alive as far as I know, but has dropped out of sight. Droege went back to dealing with drugs and was shot to death in his apartment building in Scarborough in 2005. What they speak to, though, in their activities is to this residue of hate that is still with us. The Klan does not exist as a formal organization in this country, as far as I can tell. Every once in a while, you get individuals popping up in the media claiming that they're the new face of the Klan in Canada. Sometimes they are. Frequently, I think it's self-serving. But what you do get, and what we have seen over the last 20 years, is an online cyber presence, not just of the Klan, but of a large number of other organizations preaching the same ideas that the Klan preached in this country 100 years ago. Many of those ideas created by the Ku Klux Klan out of nothing. Warped ideas of religion, warped ideas of race, and used those ideas to sell memberships in the Klan and to propagate ideas that disturbed not only civil society, but civil peace in a way that's not helpful and continues to be an ongoing concern in this country and in the United States. And I think we see some of the evidence of that in events over the last few years, not just in the United States, but also in this country. And if you want to get a flavor of the kinds of ideas that the Klan marketed 100 years ago, and that some of their followers and imitators continue to market, I encourage you to go online and spend some time looking at some of these websites. It's not a pretty picture, and it, I think, is a cause for considerable concern about race relations and civil society in this country generally. I've talked very quickly and rather superficially about a large number of things and a large number of ideas. If you have an interest in pursuing it, I refer you to my book, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions you might have and try and respond to them as best I can. Thank you very much for your attention.
So if somebody has a question, if they would put their hand up, and if you'd stop sharing, Allan, then I'll be able to see them a little bit better.
Sure.
But while you're doing that, I have a curiosity question, and then we'll take some more questions from the floor. Isn't it interesting that the garb of the Ku Klux Klan reminds me of the Crusades in Europe?
It is very similar. And I think that one thing that to remember about the uniform of the Klan, if I can call it that, is that it is largely a Hollywood creation. It was created by the people who were creating the sets and the costumes and the production reality for The Birth of a Nation in Hollywood in the early part of the 20th century. The original Klan had a very simple, literally bedsheet kind of hood that they wore. The robes and all of the other regalia that we see is almost exclusively a Hollywood creation, which I think speaks to the power of media and speaks to the power of images that we see on screens.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any questions? And if you do, David, if you'd like to unmute and then ask your question.
Hi, I found that very informative and interesting, but what does Ku Klux Klan mean or stand for?
There's a large literature on that. The name apparently came from the founding meeting of the Klan in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865. It was said, well, I'll give you two theories or two stories, but there are many others. One, that Ku Klux Klan was the sound that a musket made as it was being readied for firing, which might be true given that many of the founders of the Klan were former Confederate soldiers and would be quite familiar with the sound. So that's one story. The other story is that it's based on some interpretation of ancient Greek, and as some of the early leaders of the Klan belonged to Greek fraternities at military school, the thinking is that it had some specific meaning based on their understanding of ancient Greek. And there are a number of other theories going back to Scottish rite ceremonies in Freemasonry. So I'd like to answer that question, but I'm not the only one who can't. There's a number of theories around it, but to be fair, it's a catchy kind of a name. So it caught on and widely promoted and instantly recognizable as the name of an organization.
Are there any other questions? Judy, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
I'm curious, you just mentioned the Scottish Rite. And I guess I'm shocked by all of this. I grew up in Southern Ontario, and I was certainly aware of contemporaries of mine who were Roman Catholic in the Hamilton, Waterloo area, who were discriminated against pretty significantly because they were Catholic. But did the Klan spawn either the Orange Lodge or the Scottish Rite, or is it just simply coincidence?
It's not a coincidence, but the Orange Lodge, for example, had been present in this country in the mid-1800s. So it had a very strong presence, both as a fraternal organization, as a political influencer, if you will. And so the pro-British, pro-Protestant, anti-French, anti-Catholic sentiments that the Klan represented and preached were widely present in Ontario and across the country in the early part of the 20th century. The arrival of the Klan spouting some of the same kinds of ideas was a happy coincidence, if you will. The early membership of the Klan largely was drawn from Orange Lodge membership, and some of the early recruiting meetings were held in Orange Lodge halls, not just in Ontario, but in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and elsewhere. So it's what I referred to earlier. There was a residue and an undercurrent of bigotry and race relations in this country prior to the arrival of the Klan. The Klan just took advantage of it. And the fact in Canada that the Black population, which the Klan originally targeted in the United States, the fact that in Canada the Black population was relatively small meant that the Klan needed new targets in order to organize themselves against. And so Roman Catholics and the Roman Catholic Church and Francophones and newly arrived immigrants all provided new targets for the Klan. And given the existing state of relations in some parts of the country, they were able to take advantage of that to sell memberships. I mean, I have to say the Klan during the 1920s was by and large a commercial endeavor, which took advantage of public sentiments in some areas, whereas the Klan in the 1980s and since is much more of an ideological organization driven by different kinds of pressures than what we saw in the 1920s. So yes, the Klan promoted anti-Catholicism, but they didn't create it. And I think that's important, I think, to a distinction to keep in mind.
Right. I wonder, do you know what the membership of the KKK in Canada is at the moment?
I have no sense of it at the moment. As I said, I can't determine any kind of organizational presence in this country where people put on the hoods and get together and burn crosses. That's very old school and would attract a lot of negative attention. So
I fear the systemic nature of racism in this country is a whole lot larger than any of us imagine.
But if you go online, I was shocked at the kind of presence and the nature of the discussions that you can find without any trouble at all on the internet, which has caused me a lot of concern about young people, excuse me, being exposed to these kinds of ideas without really falling into it, without really appreciating what it is they're being exposed to. I did a presentation for the Ottawa School Board where I spent a lot of time talking about this and got a sense that young people are not unaware of what's out there. Some of them are aware of what it really is, and others are not. So it's I think, a cause for concern.
Very disturbing. I appreciate your presentation.
Thank you. John, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much for this talk. It's been very interesting. I was just thinking, as a progression from what the original Ku Klux Klan was going against, could that be showing up now as an example, that those 4 people that were killed the other day by some young fellow that has obviously been brainwashed by somebody to in this hate regime?
I have no information on that case beyond what's in the media. That said, the more I hear about that situation, the more troubling I find it, because I have a concern that it may be an expression of what I've talked about, what you can find online and the kind of ideas and influence that that kind of material has, particularly on young people.
Yeah. I think perhaps, Margaret, do you have a question?
Just about going online, I was just wondering, what do you type? Do you just type hate speech if you wanted to see what kind of things are online?
Yes. I'm not going to give you any specific websites because I decided quite a while ago. I wasn't going to be that helpful on that topic, but I think if you go on with that set of search terms, you'll probably find yourself immersed in a cesspool of hate before long.
I'll probably be sorry I went there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Reading between the lines, I would say yes. I think that's the end of the questions. Maybe we could get Doug to unmute.
There,
Doug?
I think I'm unmuted. Well, Alan, that was the most interesting revelation of a part of our history. And it's extremely important that we understand our history and what goes on and what has gone on and what continues to go on. We're very surprised at what we don't see, but is still happening behind the scenes, such as the KKK, such as other orders that have extreme ideas, etc., etc. We really appreciate your insight into this. And as I was listening to it, I thought of something that I put in most of my genealogy reports, is a statement from back in the 1700s. Only who knows his past has a future. That applies to us as individuals and as society. So you really did a great revelation for us, and we really all appreciate it. Thanks very much, said Alan.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
And I add my thanks to you also, Alan. That was absolutely fascinating. I had no idea, absolutely no idea that the Ku Klux Klan was so prevalent in Canada. That brings us to the end of our meeting, everyone. Now, I should remind you that we will be looking for new executive members as we get towards September, October, and hopefully start to reopen. So if you're interested, please contact me and I will forward your name to a nomination committee that we will set up in August. Our next meeting is July the 21st, and will feature the lovely gentleman talking about Highway 43 and all the roundabouts that we're going to be coming up against. So thank you everyone for attending, and we'll see you next month. Anna, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't. That was great. I enjoyed it as well and found it really interesting.
Yes, indeed, it was. Thank you, everyone. And
thanks, everybody. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
We'll see you all next month.
See you next month. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Really great.
Okay. I'll wait till a few more people leave before I turn it off. Okay, bye everyone.